My name is Mohammed Almazi, and this is Truth Defense. In January of this year, the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock forward, quote, largely, though not exclusively, because of the mounting dangers of the war in Ukraine. The clock now stands at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to global catastrophe it has ever been, end quote. There has been increased talk about the risk of nuclear war posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, along with the US and NATO's concurrent behavior. To discuss the truth of the matter is Professor Peter Kuznick. Peter Kuznick is Professor of History and founder and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He has authored and co-authored numerous books, including The Untold History of the United States, which he co-authored with Oliver Stone, and which was turned into a 12-part Showtime documentary film series of the same name. He's also written several other books on scientists and politics, Cold War culture, U.S. empire, and nuclear history. Professor Kuznick, welcome back to Truth Defense.
Glad to be with you, Mohammed.
So I would like to read you a passage of something written by journalist and author Eric Schlosser, because I believe it does a good job of encapsulating what has been the dominant narrative since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, and perhaps even before then. Schlosser, who has written quite thoughtfully on the dangers of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon systems, most notably in the book Command and Control, Nuclear Weapons, the Damascus Incident, and the Illusion of Safety. Eric Schlosser argued in The Atlantic in January of this year that Russian fears over NATO are misplaced and even ludicrous, and that Russia has benefited from trillions of dollars of investment and technology transfer from the West. He goes on to say, in part, quote, propaganda being pushed by Russia blames the United States for the war and has four main tenets. First, that a long-standing American effort to bring Ukraine into NATO poses a grave threat to Russian security. Second, that American shipments of weapons to Ukraine have prolonged the fighting and caused needless suffering among civilians. Third, that American support for Ukraine is just a pretext for seeking the destruction of Russia. And finally, that American policies could soon prove responsible for causing an all-out nuclear war, end quote. Schlosser continues to say that those arguments are based on lies. They're being spread to justify Russia's unprecedented use of nuclear blackmail to seize territory from a neighboring state. And that is why the greatest nuclear threat we face is a Russian victory in Ukraine. Now, how do you respond to these points? And I can go back to them in turn. And I should point out, this is not to pick on Eric Schlosser. Rather, I've chosen his article and these points that he's made because they reflect a fairly dominant narrative that we've heard from NATO states and the establishment press. So what do you say in relation to his rejection that long-standing U.S. efforts to bring Ukraine into NATO pose a grave threat to Russian security?
Let me start by saying that Eric is not alone. And it's not only the view of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, which Ben Rhodes labeled the blob during the Obama administration. This is also the view of a small, though not insignificant, segment of the left in the United States and Europe. This hostility toward Russia and dismissing this idea that Russia has no interest that the West is infringing upon. I think that view is nonsense. But I've been arguing this with very, very intelligent, well-informed people for years now. We have to trace, Russia's concerns about the expansion of NATO have been stated over and over again by Russian leaders. They've also been stated by U.S. leaders. George Kennan, even Paul Nitze at one point, Bill Bradley. When the U.S. announced in 2008, the George W. Bush administration announced that that NATO was going to expand to put Ukraine and Georgia on the fast track. It was Burns, who is the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, who wrote a secret memo back to the White House titled "Niet means niet. Don't cross Russia's red lines. Listen to what Russia is saying about NATO expansion. And we could trace this back to 1990, when Gorbachev agreed to allow the reunification of Germany. At that point, U.S. and Germany and the British gave assurances that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, 1 thumb's width to the east. Before that year was out, NATO was already meeting about expansion. They delayed it until the end of the decade under Clinton. And then 1997, 1998, they began their expansion. So initially 3 countries, but then during the next George W. Bush administration, they expanded further, quite a bit further, including some former Soviet republics. But then when they talked about bringing Ukraine and Georgia in, that was too much. That crossed Russia's red lines. And Russia responded. They responded first in Georgia militarily. But then when the coup occurred in Ukraine, the Russians moved in there and effectively supported the liberation forces in the Donbass. And but that was the beginning. Then civil war started. There was the anti-Russian government put in Kyiv, and then a civil war began in the Donbass, really. And that expanded in 2022, and Russia issued some very direct warnings in 2021 and 2022. And then the invasion began on February 24th, 2022. Many of us didn't think that Putin was reckless enough to do that, because we understood not only was it uncalled for aggression on Russia's part, but it also made the world that much more dangerous. But Russia thought it would be a quick and easy victory. It turned out not to be. Ukrainian resistance was greater than Russia expected, and the West had been arming, and NATO had been arming Ukraine and training them, and they were prepared. And Ukrainian morale defending their country was much greater than Russian morale invading it. And Ukrainian strategy was better than Russian strategy. And so for a lot of reasons, the Russian offensive stalled. And then we can go through some of that history. But the first point is that from the Russian perspective, as much as the US ignores it or dismisses it, Russia did feel threatened and encircled by NATO expansion. The second point.
Before we go to that, maybe I could ask you why? Why is it that Ukraine or Georgia joining NATO would be seen in almost existential terms, one that would be, from the Russian perspective at least, capable of justifying an invasion?
Well, let me respond first by saying there was actually no chance of Ukraine or Georgia joining NATO. In fact, there was overt opposition. It has to be done by consensus. Anybody can block it. Many countries were going to block it. And there was also a frozen conflict going on, which meant that NATO was not going to be expanding to Ukraine or Georgia in either case. So that issue, while the concerns, the geopolitical concerns, were real, some people draw the analogy, how would the United States respond if Mexico or Canada joined the Chinese or the Russian bloc militarily? If the Chinese or the Russians had trainers and put their arms, and we saw what happened with the Cuba in 1962. This would be even more of a threat today, the way the world is divided. So I think that the concern was legitimate on Russia's part. I don't think that NATO really needed or intended to try to overthrow Russia, but putting those weapons there, including nuclear weapons, which were already much too close to Russia, was really crossing Russia's red line. And I can understand why Russia felt threatened and encircled, and they saw the West as just increasingly aggressive. The second question about U.S. weapons and the effect that they're having on this war. I think that the U.S. and NATO, but the U.S. mostly, is providing one weapon system after another that the U.S. first says they're not going to provide because it's too provocative. But then they end up providing anyway. And that's now even gone to so far as the HIMARS, the Javelins, the Abrams tanks, the F-16s. They haven't provided the ATACMS Army missiles yet, but they're probably coming also. So what they initially said is we're only going to give defensive weapons and not give Ukraine weapons by which they could attack inside Russia. Well, they have those weapons, and they have been attacking inside Russia. And so the United States has systematically dismissed Russia's red lines. The U.S. has now given $43 billion in military aid to Ukraine and more than $70 billion overall. So there's been some financial aid, some humanitarian aid, but mostly military aid. And that pipeline is still open. What people are concerned about in Ukraine and the Biden administration is that the Republican opposition to further arming Ukraine is mounting. The latest survey I saw was that 62% of Republicans say the U.S. has already given too much aid to Ukraine. We know that's the view of Ramaswamy, who's kind of an idiot. And there's also the view of Trump, who's totally an idiot, but, or whatever we want to call him. We can figure out names. Trump is pretty much a dangerous demagogue. But he might be right on these issues for the wrong reasons. Just the same way he was right when he said, why shouldn't Russia and the United States get along? We should find common grounds. But that's not the view that the Biden administration has taken. And so the U.S. arming of Ukraine keeps the war going. There are many people, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and many Republicans who think that we have to, instead of simply trying to find a military solution, we have to look for a diplomatic off-ramp. That's not the prevailing view, but it's a growing view in the United States and elsewhere. Recently, even the assistant to Stoltenberg in NATO had said that. It's time for diplomacy. General Milley, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff last November, said that this kind of ongoing warfare does not make sense. Maybe we can solve this through diplomacy. There have been efforts at diplomacy. We've got Guterres at the United Nations. We've got the Pope speaking out for diplomacy consistently, the Vatican. We've got Lula in Brazil. We've got Xi Jinping put forth a 12-point peace plan. Some of it condemning the NATO, some of it even condemning Russia and defending sovereignty. But that's been dismissed. We've got African countries. We've got Turkey. Every once in a while, Macron. So there's a lot of people who realize that if we don't find diplomacy, the likelihood of a military victory for either side is very, very negligible. And so we're likely to be back at the same place a year from now. This war will go on. It will be stalemate. Neither side will have the power to achieve its ends. The Russians will not win militarily. Zelensky will not succeed in driving Russia out of every inch of Ukraine. And we have 500,000 more people dead and wounded. It's tragic. People are going back to their homes in Ukraine without arms and legs, without genitals, without eyes. It's a tragic war. And the way it's being fought now with trench warfare. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has largely stalled. They're making a little bit of headway, just like the Russians have made a little bit of headway before that. But they're not going to get their land bridge. They're not going to get to the Sea of Azov. The Russians are too laid in there. The land is too well defended. They might have performed stupidly and incompetently in the beginning of the war, but they learned a lot of lessons. And now they're dug in, and they've got tunnels, and they've got trenches, and they've got minefields, frightening minefields. And for that reason, Ukraine is having a hard time recruiting. You look now, Zelensky is cracking down, and he's asking the Europeans to extradite the tens of thousands of Ukrainians who have fled to other parts of Europe. And Poland initially said it would, then it backed down. And why are these people afraid? Are they cowards? No, but nobody wants to be sent into that meat grinder. Nobody wants to be sent into a war where in the first week they're very likely to be wounded and sent back in either in a body bag or on a hospital gurney. So I can understand. We lived through that in the United States during Vietnam. The people who refused to go were not cowards, but they were morally opposed to the war and thought that the U.S. position was horrific. And they saw people coming back in body bags and on stretchers. So the Ukrainians are in a similar position. The ones who were gung-ho, patriots, militarists, signed up immediately. But now they're having a very hard time filling those ranks with all enormous numbers dead and wounded, and on the Russian side also.
Sorry, you raised, because we have limited time actually to discuss this, but you raised the issue of peace proposals. Are you aware? I mean, it was reported previously in the Times of London that secret peace negotiations between Zelensky on the one hand and can you hear me?
You froze there, so I missed you.
Okay, so are you aware of negotiated or peace proposals or peace negotiations between Vladimir Putin and Zelensky of Ukraine that were ultimately sabotaged when Boris Johnson went over to Ukraine and explained that now is not the time for peace and that NATO would not support any peace negotiation at this time? And I also believe a former Israeli Prime Minister, Benny Gantz, also came, not Benny Gantz, sorry, forgive me, former Israeli Prime Minister who was briefly actually the Israeli Prime Minister before Benjamin Netanyahu, or in between Netanyahu's two terms, also came out and said that the US had basically stymied peace negotiations. So what do you know about this? What are you aware of this? And why would the US or the UK interfere with peace negotiations and try to stop them or sabotage them?
There are many people in both countries, many leaders, who see this as an opportunity to weaken Russia, to embarrass Russia. We could go back to Brzezinski's grand chessboard in 1997, where he talked about, he said, if Ukraine can be wrested away from the Russian orbit, then Russia will never become a superpower again. That was the view of the neocons in the Bush administration, Libby and Hadley and Cheney and the others. This is the US and the Brits have been the most hawkish. The Poles have been very hawkish also. But when Boris Johnson went over there, at that point in 2020, in March of 2022, it looked like they were going to have a settlement. It looked like Ukraine was going to be neutralized, that they would not join NATO, and that Russia, maybe we could have gone back to Minsk II. And Minsk II would have left the Donbass as part of Ukraine. It would give them much more autonomy, but the Russians would have left. And that would have been a very wise solution. But Macron and Scholz later admitted, Merkel admitted that they really were stalling for time when they settled for that in 2015. They had no intention of implementing it. Same thing in 2022. So it looks like they're going to be in agreement. Johnson goes over there and convinces Zelensky not to give in. Says the West is going to provide arms and support in an unlimited fashion for as long as it takes. And we can militarily defeat Russia and teach them a lesson. And Zelensky went along with it. And now there's a couple 100,000 Ukrainians who have paid the price. All of Ukraine has, and all of the world has. It's tragic that they didn't allow that to go forward. The United States certainly supported Boris Johnson in that effort. But the situation is tragic. And now Biden and Sunak are two of the biggest cheerleaders for further militarization of this crisis. And the other point that you raised in the beginning from the Scholz article is the idea of the nuclear threat, which Scholz dismisses. And a lot of people have said that. They say, well, initially we didn't want to do certain things because we thought it was crossing Russia's red lines and that the Russians might react with tactical nuclear weapons. Said, but they haven't reacted to any of these. And therefore we can assume that they're not going to react no matter what we do. And that's the craziness of deterrence theory. Deterrence works till the point that it doesn't work. And then there's nobody left alive to tell these idiots they were wrong, which is exactly what John Kennedy said during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when his Joint Chiefs were urging him to bomb the missile sites and invade Cuba and overthrow the government there. Kennedy left the room and said, listen to these brass hats. If we do what they say, there'll be nobody left alive to tell them they were wrong. And Kennedy was right. But that did not happen in this war. And we didn't have wiser heads prevail. And it's clearly Russian aggression. Russia is not in the right in this war by any means, but there is nobody who's in the right. I mean, nobody's on the right side. I think everybody's looking at it from their own narrow, myopic interest and not from the interest of the global community. And so the nuclear threat is real. And the Biden administration, was just an article that came out yesterday in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. You start off by saying that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has moved the hands of the doomsday clock now to 90 seconds before midnight. When it started back in 1947, we were much further from midnight. Then in 1953, after the US and the Soviets tested their hydrogen bombs, the Soviets wasn't an actual hydrogen bomb, but we thought it was. Then they moved it to 2 minutes before midnight. After the US and North Korea almost went to war in 2017, they moved it in early 2018 to 90 seconds, to 100 seconds before midnight. Now, last year, they moved it to 90 seconds. I think it should be closer than that. I think we've got very, very dangerous elements calling the shots in both countries right now, in all countries. And so I just did several shows on Indian TV today, and Modi is trying to put himself forward as a spokesperson, as the global leader, since he has not gone along with the US demands, and he's very closely allied with Russia. And India still gets 85% of its arms from Russia and a lot of cheap oil and gas. Modi can be kind of a broker. And if he does that, that would be wonderful for the world, for him to play that role. It's not clear that he can or will, but we don't know, who can play that role, but there's several people who are vying for that. And we need that desperately, because the longer this goes on, the more chance there is of World War III starting, not on purpose, but inadvertently. And we've seen near calls, close calls, that we've seen near misses. And, if certain things happen that the West wants to happen, it puts Russia in a weaker position. Biden has said, and Putin has said, that Russia's policy is, if they feel that they're threatened existentially, they would resort to tactical nuclear weapons. Biden has said that if Russia feels that it's going to be defeated, there's a real chance it would use tactical nuclear weapons. But the US policy is to put Russia in that position where it feels that it is going to be militarily defeated, even though we know that that could trigger nuclear war. And that's madness. So John Kennedy said it in his 1963 American University commencement address.
Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
And that's what we're confronting. He understood that, but he was a lot smarter and a lot better statesman than Biden or Blinken or Sullivan or Harris or Austin or the other clowns they have around them. It's a dangerous situation. And we've got people with the mentality of children who are lighting the fuse. And so it gets more dangerous the longer this war goes on, which people around the world realize, but they're helpless victims. It's very instructive that the Oppenheimer movie is doing so well all over the world. In the US, there was a lot of competition between Oppenheimer and Barbie won out. But around the world, people are watching the Oppenheimer movie. And what is the message there? That Oppenheimer might have put us on the glide path to the global destruction, to the end of life on the planet. It's a very, very passionately anti-nuclear movie. It has its flaws, but it also sends a clear anti-nuclear message. And that's what the world needs to hear right now.
Professor Peter Kuznick, thank you very much. In fact, there's the beginning of your answers. You mentioned that there are U.S. congressmen and members of the Republican Party who oppose continuing the conflict in Ukraine. Although when you listen to them, many of them seem to argue that the basis of a desire to end, at least part of it, to end the conflict with Russia in Ukraine is at least somewhat, if not largely, motivated by a desire to focus on conflict with China. And that would then bring us to the next topic of our next discussion. But for now, Peter Kuznick, thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you, Mohammed.